My dad was an LAPD officer in the early 1980s, a time when the city was rife with all manners of crime and chaos. Over the years, he's shared many stories, but there's one that stands out for its sheer bizarre and unsettling nature. It was the kind of incident that stays with you, a stark reminder of the darker side of human nature and the unpredictability of law enforcement work. It happened on a routine night shift. The city was shrouded in its usual blanket of smog and dim streetlights. The call came in as something relatively mundane. A car had been parked outside a warehouse for a few hours, unmoving, possibly casing the place for a burglary. Dad was nearby and responded to the call, figuring it was just another run-of-the-mill check. As he approached the car, the first thing he noticed was the blood. It was smeared across all the windows, a chilling sight that instantly put him on high alert. His hand instinctively rested on his service weapon as he edged closer to the driver's side. Peering through the blood-streaked window, he saw a man in the driver's seat, completely naked and covered head to toe in blood. The man's eyes were closed, his body slumped in a way that suggested either unconsciousness or worse. Dad knocked on the window, heart pounding, preparing for any number of dangerous scenarios. Slowly, the man in the car opened his eyes and turned his head towards Dad. It was then that the full horror of the situation became apparent. The man had mutilated himself, having cut off both of his ears with a pair of large fabric shears that now sat ominously on the passenger seat. Keeping his voice steady, Dad asked the man to step out of the car. He complied, dazed and disoriented, moving as if in a trance. Dad cuffed him for safety and immediately called for an ambulance. There was something in the man's vacant gaze and the surreal, bloody scene that told him this wasn't a typical criminal act. While they waited for the ambulance, Dad tried to talk to the man, to understand what had driven him to such an extreme act. The story that unfolded was as tragic as it was strange. The man, whose name has long since faded from memory, had been on a PCP bender. Under the influence of the powerful hallucinogenic, he had begun to hear a persistent buzzing in his ears. In his altered state, the sound became unbearable, a ceaseless torment that drove him to the unthinkable. He had driven himself to a secluded spot outside the warehouse, perhaps seeking a quiet place away from prying eyes. There, in the grips of a drug-induced psychosis, he took the shears and did the unspeakable, cutting off his own ears in a desperate attempt to silence the noise. As the ambulance arrived and the paramedics took over, Dad was left with a feeling of profound sadness for the man and a deep sense of the unpredictability of human behavior. The incident was a tragic reminder of the destructive power of drugs like PCP, which could warp reality and lead to unimaginable acts of self-harm. For years afterward, Dad would recount the story not with the excitement of a cop sharing a wild tale from the beat, but with a somber tone reflecting on the human tragedy of it all. It was a story that underscored the harsh realities of his job, the encounters with people at their lowest, the witnessing of human suffering and the aftermath of poor choices. My first night out of the academy after graduation was a Friday, and I was scheduled to have the night off, returning for work on Monday. Of course, a friend of mine who had gone through the previous academy called me and said, "Hey, come ride with me." He had cleared it with his sergeant to let me ride, and off we went. Of course I wouldn't get paid, but it was still worth it because I had just graduated. The whole night was dull, just checking buildings, a couple of traffic stops, and driving the rural roads of Georgia. At about 2 a.m., I was ready to call it quits, and he turned around heading back to town to drop me off. On the way, we saw a broken-down Buick Century with a male and female outside of it, looking lost. We stopped and checked on them and found out they had run out of gas within the site of a gas station. Since the Century was on top of the interstate overpass, there was a slight hill leading down to the gas station. We decided that we would push the car to get to the edge of the hill, and then they would stop and jump in. We would then give them one good last push where hopefully they would just coast into the gas station. Since the Buick had a cheap hollow plastic bumper, my partner decided that we couldn't use the patrol car's push bumper to push the car as it might break or crack the cheap bumper. So he volunteered me to push while he followed in the patrol car, running blue lights so no one would run smack into us. Everything was going fine, the three of us pushing to the edge with little problem. Me in the back while the male pushed from the driver's side door and the female on the passenger side. When we reached the edge of the hill, I called for him to stop and get in. Instead of getting in, he started running, pushing harder and faster. Then suddenly, as the car began to get up to good speed, he hopped in. The female, being larger and much heavier, attempts the same but slips. I'm so stunned, watching her hold on for dear life, one hand on the passenger door, the other on the roof of the car. She is being drugged down the road, and I'm just so out of it that I was still pushing. Once I came to, I started yelling for him to stop. I have no idea to this day how he couldn't see her next to him barely holding on. He never attempts to stop the car, he just lets it roll. Right as the car is almost at the bottom of the hill, it's going about 40 or 50 miles per hour. Right as I think she can hold to the gas station, she just looks up into the car, gives up, and lets go. The back tire catches both of her legs right at the knees. I could hear the crack. I put my hands on my ears at the sound. We call an ambulance and our sergeant shows up. He speaks to the driver as my partner and I are sweating bullets. I knew it was over. I had spent almost 2 years working in the jail to earn the right to go to the academy, and it's over all in 1 second. Worst of all, I wasn't even getting paid. The sergeant walks over, and I'm just ready to take my duty belt off, hand it to him, and just go home. He just laughed, patted me on the shoulder, then said it wasn't my fault. The male driver should have stopped. My dad has always been the archetype of a stoic police officer, always downplaying the dangers of his job to avoid worrying us. But one morning, he came home looking visibly shaken, a rare occurrence that immediately caught my attention. I was a teenager then, old enough to handle the truth, so I pressed him for details. This is what he told me. It happened during a graveyard shift. Dad and his partner were patrolling the quieter streets of our town when they came across a seemingly abandoned car parked on the side of the road. Something about the car didn't sit right with them, so they decided to investigate. Dad approached the vehicle first while his partner stayed behind to call in a radio report. As Dad got closer, he realized the car wasn't abandoned at all. Inside were several people, all of them looking extremely strung out. He sensed trouble immediately. Just as he was about to call his partner over for backup, he heard him running towards him. Dad identified himself as police to the people in the car, his voice firm but calm, asking about weapons or anything else they needed to be aware of. His partner came around to help get the people out of the car. That's when they saw it, a gun lying on one of the seats. It was a tense moment, the discovery of the firearm raising the stakes of the situation. While they was talking to the group, trying to ascertain whose gun it was, one of the individuals managed to slip away from his sight. Dad, meanwhile, was talking to the driver at the front of the car. Suddenly, the driver's eyes went wide with fear, and he began to back away. Confused, Dad turned around and found himself face to face with the barrel of a handgun. The man who had slipped away was now pointing the gun directly at the back of Dad's head. Despite his years of experience and training, the proximity of the gun and the potential for a fatal outcome sent a chill down his spine. Dad, maintaining his composure, began to talk to the man. He spoke in a soothing, steady tone, telling him to take his finger off the trigger. As he did this, Dad slowly raised his hands in a surrender gesture. It was a risky move, but he knew he had to act fast. The moment the man's finger eased off the trigger, Dad quickly reached out and wedged his own finger behind it, preventing the man from firing. He then called out for his partner, who rushed over and helped to handcuff the man. The situation could have ended disastrously had the driver not reacted the way he did. His wide-eyed expression of fear was the only warning Dad had of the impending threat. Dad ended the story there, and I could see the incident had left its mark on him. He had faced dangerous situations before, but this one hit close to home. It was a vivid example of how quickly things can escalate and how the line between life and death can be terrifyingly thin. I sat there processing the story, a mix of fear and admiration running through me. My dad, who I had always seen as invincible, had come so close to a life-threatening situation. It made me realize the sacrifices and risks law enforcement officers face every day. That morning, as Dad recounted his experience, I gained a new level of respect for him and his profession. His quick thinking and bravery had likely saved not just his own life, but potentially others as well. I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude that he was sitting there with me, safe and sound. I've been a patrol officer for a good part of a decade, but nothing in my experience had prepared me for what happened that night. It was one of those shifts that seemed uneventful until it wasn't. I was assigned to monitor a stop sign, a quiet spot notorious for a gruesome, unsolved murder a few years back. It was around 2 to 3 in the morning and the world seemed asleep under the blanket of night. The night was calm, eerily so. The stop sign, illuminated by my car's headlights, stood as a solitary sentinel at the crossroads. I remember idly sipping my coffee, the only sound being the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. That's when it happened. In my rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of something, a fleeting shadow that darted across the back of my patrol car. I straightened up, eyes fixed on the mirror, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. My rational mind suggested it could be an animal, perhaps a stray dog or a raccoon, but the speed at which it moved was unnatural. As I was still trying to process it, the shadow shot up the driver's side of my car, then darted across the front. It was just a blur, a black smudge against the night, but its presence sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't just the suddenness of its movements, but the fact that I couldn't make out any definitive shape or form. It was as if the shadow itself was alive. Every instinct in me screamed that it was time to leave. I've heard the old tales from the locals about this area, the whispers of something sinister lingering after the murder, but I'd always dismissed them as superstitions. That night, though, I wasn't taking any chances. I gunned the engine and sped down the road, leaving the stop sign and the eerie shadow far behind. My heart was racing and my mind was reeling. What had I just witnessed? In an attempt to rationalize the experience, I remembered the video cameras installed in the patrol cars. They're designed to turn on automatically at certain speeds, a feature meant for capturing high-speed pursuits or emergencies. Once I'd put some distance between myself and the shadow, I pulled over, my hands still trembling slightly. I needed to see the footage. I had to know if what I saw was real or just a trick of light and shadow. I scrolled through the camera's recordings, finding the timestamp that matched my hasty departure from the stop sign. The screen showed the familiar view of the road ahead, bathed in the glow of my headlights. But as the playback reached the moment when the shadow should have crossed in front of the car, the screen went black. Not the black of a malfunctioning camera or a power cut, but an opaque, consuming darkness, as if something had blocked the lens completely. I rewound the footage, watching it again and again, but the result was the same. Each time, at the exact moment when the shadow crossed, the camera seemed to be obscured by an impenetrable darkness. It was as if whatever I saw didn't want to be captured, didn't want to be known. The rest of my shift passed in a blur. I couldn't shake off the feeling of unease, the sense that I'd encountered something unnatural, something that defied explanation. Back at the station, I debated whether to tell my colleagues about it, but what would I say? That a shadow haunted that crossroad? I kept the experience to myself, but it changed how I viewed the quiet night shifts. The rational part of me wanted to chalk it up to fatigue or a trick of the mind. But another part, a part I didn't know existed, couldn't dismiss the fear, the primal dread that I felt when that shadow enveloped my car.